Okay, so what are we talking about when we talk about logic? Well, we're talking about arguments, but not arguments in the sense that you might think. We've given it sort of a technical definition. What we're really doing when we talk about logic is we want to talk about and understand the structure of not arguments between two peoples, but an argument that someone can construct for a certain conclusion. So you might make an argument for our obligation not to eat meat, maybe. And your conclusion is something like, well, we shouldn't eat meat. We have a moral obligation not to eat maybe just factory farmed meat or something like this. I don't know if y'all have heard these arguments before. And the premises often have something to do with, if you're familiar with these arguments, something to do with how inhumane factory farming is, and how if you don't eat factory farmed meat, you can reduce the amount of animals killed or something like this. And then the opponents obviously come back and say, yeah, well, actually, it doesn't matter if you choose not to eat. I want you to do it. There's lots of research out there that shows you're not learning until you're actively involved. So please pause and try to answer the questions as I give them. Okay, so let me share my screen, and I'll pull up this PowerPoint. In fact, I'll even full screen it for you. Hopefully y'all can see that in a full screen mode. Okay, so we're going to do some basic logic. I'm going to introduce you to some concepts. We're going to practice some, and it's really the practice where you're really going to gain something, okay? I want you to practice with this stuff. So here's an argument. Let me just read it for you. The players will go back to work if agreement is reached about their salaries, but this will be achieved, if at all, only if some of them take early retirement. So the players will not go back to work unless some retire early. Okay, so this is an argument. Broadly speaking, that is, it's trying to get you to believe something. And what is that thing that this argument is trying to get you to believe? Take a pause and see if you can identify it. It's one of the three sentences. Which one is it? Okay, if you paused, here's what we're trying to ask, broad strokes, when we do evaluate arguments. Well, one of the basic questions. First, we got to figure out what the conclusion is. What is the thing that is being argued for? And then once we figure that out, that's the first question. The second question is, yeah, once we figure that out, how do the other parts of the argument relate to the conclusion? Properly speaking, they should support the conclusion. That's not always the case. Sometimes there's extraneous, irrelevant information in there. Okay, so here's some definitions. An argument, but a set of claims, some of which are supposed to provide support for one of the others. So an argument is a conclusion and premises, in other words. A conclusion is the claim that's supposed to be supported, that we're trying to argue for, and the premises are the claims that are supposed to support the conclusion. I don't think any of this is really complex or counterintuitive. We're just trying to introduce terms that make it a little easier to talk about the various components of the argument. Obviously, every argument is trying to argue for something, and we're just going to call that the conclusion. And obviously, every argument uses something to argue for that conclusion, and we're just going to call those things the premises, or the premises. So on this argument, I asked you to stop and evaluate what the premises and what the conclusion are. Well, sorry, I just gave you the answer, but in this case, it's the last sentence that is the conclusion. Now, if we were in class, I'd ask y'all to do this, and I'd ask y'all to tell me why you thought that the last sentence was the conclusion. So maybe take a minute now and see if you can pause the video, see if you can answer why it was. You probably did it kind of instinctively, intuitively, like you didn't think it through. But what was it that told you that that was the conclusion? Pause and answer. So if you did, what you probably said was something like, well, it came last. That's one thing. So it came last, so maybe that's an indication. Also, there's the word so. So that helps. It kind of, the so kind of points to the fact that that's the conclusion. And maybe if you're thinking real hard, you might think, well, it's not just like these little linguistic indicators. It's kind of like I just understood the content of the argument, and that's really the only way of making sense of the flow of the argument, that they're arguing that the players will not go back to work unless some retire early. I mean, it doesn't make sense construing any of the other things as the conclusion, independently of the word so or the fact that this sentence came last. Okay, so what we're going to do in this course a lot, and what I'm going to try to get y'all comfortable doing, although it is a little counterintuitive, is formalizing the argument in this way. And really, it's very simple. We're going to put numbers for the premises and conclusion. We're going to put the conclusion last, and we're going to use a therefore before the conclusion to indicate that it's the conclusion. Otherwise, this one works out really cleanly and simply. We don't have to change the order. And, we substitute the therefore for the so, but whatever. You could use so there if you wanted. But what this does for us is not magic, right? What it does for us is it gives us a way of seeing the structure of the argument more clearly, seeing that the conclusion is that number 3. And that's going to be more important when, as we'll see, sometimes the conclusion doesn't come last in the non-formal or the informal argument. And this is going to help us. We're going to say, oh, you look at this and you know immediately, once you get familiar with this method, that this last claim, that number 3 is the conclusion, because that's just part of the formality. It also helps us talk about the premises without quoting the whole premise. Another thing it does is it lets us talk about the premises without quoting the whole premise. So you can just say, so premise 1 is false, instead of saying it's false that the players will go back to work if agreement is reached about their salaries. So it helps us abbreviate things, and you'll see that more and more as we go on. Okay, so I talked a lot in my little opening spiel about evaluating an argument. And what I mean by that is we just want to know when an argument is good. What are we looking for when we evaluate an argument, when we ask whether an argument is good? Well, generally 2 things. You want the reasoning to be good. You want the person to be, the argument to engage in good reasoning, okay? But you also want the premises, the claims it relies on to support the conclusion, to be true. Now, there's a big distinction between that, reasoning being good and claims or the support being true. You may not see it yet, but we're going to look at lots of examples, so you don't have to worry. But, generally speaking, think about it this way. There are people who reason really well, but they say false things. There are people who say true things, but they fail to reason well, right? And we'll look at some of those examples. But think about it like this. Think about the history of science, for example. There have been lots of false scientific theories out there put forward by really smart people who were doing really complicated good reasoning. It's just that one of their basic assumptions was false. But they were doing really good reasoning, right? So those people, they're doing good reasoning, but they have a false assumption or false premise in their argument. People say lots of true things but fail to reason well. I mean, it's harder for me to come up with an obvious example of that. So we'll just move on because I've got some more examples later in the presentation. Oh, here's some examples. There we go. So think about it like this. Look at this example. Anyone who plays video games eats well. Jason plays video games, so he must eat well. Okay, again, you can see the structure of the argument. Jason must eat well is the conclusion. And the 2 premises are anyone who plays video games eats well and Jason plays video games. Now, is the reasoning good? So let's evaluate this argument. Is the reasoning good? Now, you might be tempted to say no, but what you're really picking up on is that this person is making false claims in their premises. It's not true that anyone who plays video games eats well. And we don't know anything about Jason, but you might, if we were in a particular context and we were talking about a particular person, you might even say, well, it's not even true that Jason plays video games, right? There might have 2 false premises. But is the reasoning good? And the answer is yes, because, and here's how you figure that out. If those 2 claims were true, the conclusion would have to be true. If it really were true that anyone who played video games ate well, and if it really were true that Jason played video games, Jason would have to eat well. That follows. Now consider a different example. Cats are animals, and humans are animals, so we're really no different than cats. Oops, sorry. Now let's evaluate the argument again. So look, the conclusion comes last. We'll eventually get some more complicated cases, but we're just keeping it simple for now. We're really no different than cats is what I'm trying to argue for in this argument. Is it a good argument? That's what we want to know. I'm trying to convince you that we're really no different than cats. Is my argument good? Well, let's ask our two questions. Let's ask the second one first, just to make it clear. Are the claims true? Are the premises true? Are cats animals? Yep. Are humans animals? Yep. So look, second question, answer is yes. The premises are true. But is the reasoning good? No, because it's totally irrelevant, or it's largely irrelevant that just because we're animals and cats are animals, it just doesn't follow that we're really no different than cats. So the reasoning is bad. Even if those two claims were true, which they are true, the conclusion could be false. Doesn't follow. It's not really integrally related to the premises. Okay, so we talked about two ways of evaluating an argument, whether its reasoning is good and whether it makes true claims in its premises. So let's look, no good PowerPoint presentation is complete without introducing some jargon. Let's introduce just some words to talk about these two things. When we're talking about the reasoning being good, we're going to talk about validity. And that is a more formal definition. And what we mean there is not just that the reasoning is good in some vague sense, but that it's good in a very specific sense. That if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. In other words, a valid argument is one in which the truth of the premises would guarantee the truth of the conclusion. And what a sound argument is just a valid argument with all true premises. So now consider this question. Can a sound argument have a false conclusion? Okay, pause and consider that. Okay, so if you've paused, you're back, hopefully. And the answer is no. Because put these two things together, right? A sound argument is one that's valid and has true premises. Well, what's a valid argument? Well, it's one that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. So if you know that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true, and you know that the premises are true, then you know the conclusion has to be true. So if it's sound, it has that property, it cannot have a false conclusion. Okay, I think that we're done with definitions for a little bit. Okay, let's actually practice some of these skills that we've been talking about. So look, we're going to look at a few arguments. I'm going to ask you whether it's valid, whether it's sound. I'm going to give you a second to pause. Try to answer this for yourself. You don't have to write anything down. Again, you're not turning anything in, but try to pause, see if you can answer the question. All right, so here's the argument. All good dogs are bird dogs. All bird dogs have long tails. Jack is a good dog, therefore Jack has a long tail. So now pause for a second. Ask if this is a valid argument, whether it's sound. Now hold on just a second. Don't pause just yet. Again, just to remind you, when you're asking whether it's valid, you're asking whether if the premises were true, would the conclusion have to be true? Put another way, can you imagine the premises all being true but the conclusion being false? And once you answer that, if the answer is no, then you have an answer to soundness, because all sound arguments are valid. So if it's not valid, it's not sound. But if it is valid, then you have to go and see whether the premises are true. And if it's valid and the premises are true, then it's sound. Okay, so answer that question for this one. Go ahead. Okay, so if you paused, you're back. The answer here is yes and no. So yes, it's valid. No, it's not sound. The good dogs are all bird dogs. And all the bird dogs are long-tailed things. That's what this diagram says, right? So the whole circle here of good dogs falls within the circle of the bird dog circle. That's what we're representing, that all good dogs are bird dogs. And all bird dogs have long tails. That's what we're representing with the bird dog circle falling completely within the long tail circle. And then the third premise says that Jack, I think it was Jack, I can't remember what name I used, is a good dog. So he falls within the good dog circle. Those were our premises. Now our conclusion, remember, was that Jack has a long tail. So what we've got here is a representation of the truth of our premises. This is what has to be true, or a representation of what has to be true for our premises to be true. Now ask, is it possible that Jack falls within the good dog circle, given all of this, and doesn't fall within the long tail circle? And the answer is no. If he's a good dog, he has to have a long tail if all of this is true that we've drawn. Okay? So it's valid in that if all the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. Okay? I'm going to go back. I'm sorry if y'all can hear my kids laughing. I think they're watching SpongeBob or something in there. So it is valid in that if 1, 2, and 3 are all true, 4 has to be true. In other words, it can't be that 1, 2, and 3 are true, but 4 is false. Okay? Now, to ask whether it's sound, we know it's valid. Soundness is just valid and true premises. We know it's valid, so does it have true premises? Well, it looks like to me probably premise 1 is false. There are some good dogs who are not bird dogs. I don't know if my dog is one of those dogs. I mean, he's not a bird dog, but I'm not sure he's a good dog. And I believe there are bird dogs that don't have long tails. I'm not super well versed in bird doggery, but I think that there are some that don't have long tails. And we don't know anything about Jack, so we can't really evaluate the truth of 3. Jack is not my dog, but it might be false. But we know that 1 and 2 are false, and so we know it's not sound. Okay, so we'll move through the next ones a little quicker. I'm not going to go to the full screen. Okay, here's another argument. Ned has a mustache. Mustaches are ugly, therefore Ned is ugly. Okay, take a minute, see if you can determine whether it's valid and whether it's sound. Okay, if you have paused, you're back from the pausing. Okay, is it valid? The answer is no. It is not valid because it is possible. The truth of the premises doesn't guarantee the truth of the conclusion. It's possible, that is, that 1 and 2 are true and 3 is false.